Look at Beijing today. Skyscrapers stretch to the horizon, lit up like a circuit board at night. Bullet trains slide between cities of 20 million people. Factories the size of small nations produce a third of the world's manufactured goods. China is the second largest economy on the planet, and to most of the world, this looks like a rise, a meteoric, impossible climb from poverty to power in a single human lifetime. But here's the reframe. This isn't a rise, it's a return. For most of the last 2,000 years, China wasn't catching up to anyone. It was the largest economy on Earth. The last 2 centuries, the ones we think of as normal, were the anomaly. And in between, this civilization came closer to being erased than most people realize. So to understand modern China, you don't start with its rise. You start with its fall. Rewind to before 1800. For centuries, the people who lived here called their empire the Middle Kingdom, and they meant it literally. Not a country among countries, but the center of civilization itself, with everyone else living on the edges. And for a long time, the claim wasn't just arrogance, it was close to true. Chinese inventions like paper, gunpowder, the compass, and printing reshaped the world centuries before Europe caught up. Around 1800, China alone produced roughly a third of everything manufactured on the planet. If you were a merchant standing in a port city like Guangzhou at the turn of the 19th century, you would have seen a trading system that barely needed the rest of the world at all. Silk, porcelain, and tea flowed out, and Europe, especially Britain, was desperate to buy in. There was just one problem for the foreigners. China didn't want much of what they were selling, so the British found something China's own people did want, whether their government approved or not: opium. By the 1830s, British merchants were flooding southern China with opium grown in colonial India, creating a public health crisis and draining Chinese silver in the process. When Chinese officials tried to shut the trade down and seized opium stockpiles, Britain didn't back off. It sent gunboats. What followed, starting in 1839, was the First Opium War, and China's ancient armies were no match for industrial-era ships and weapons. Imagine you're standing on the deck of a Qing dynasty war junk, facing British steamships with cannons your empire had never needed to build. That mismatch was the whole story. China lost, and the peace treaty was the first of what became known as the unequal treaties. Hong Kong was ceded to Britain. Foreign powers carved out concessions, self-governing enclaves inside Chinese cities, answerable to their own laws, not China's. A second opium war in the 1850s only deepened the wound. One humiliation stacked on another, and a phrase entered the language that Chinese schoolchildren still learn today: the Century of Humiliation. The empire that had called itself the center of the world was being carved up like a losing hand at cards, and it kept losing. In 1895, Japan, a country China had long considered a lesser neighbor, defeated it in war and seized Taiwan. For a civilization that had defined itself as the center of everything, this was almost unthinkable. By the turn of the century, popular fury at foreign domination boiled over. In 1899, a movement of Chinese peasants and martial artists known as the Boxers rose up, attacking foreign missionaries, Chinese Christians, and diplomatic compounds, hoping to drive foreign influence out of the country by force. The uprising was crushed in 1901 by a coalition of foreign powers, who imposed yet another punishing settlement on the Qing government, forcing it to pay a massive indemnity and permit foreign troops to be stationed on Chinese soil. The dynasty that was supposed to protect China from humiliation had become powerless to stop it. By 1912, the strain finally broke the system completely. Revolutionaries overthrew the last emperor, ending more than 2,000 years of continuous imperial rule in China. The Middle Kingdom didn't just lose battles anymore, it lost its entire form of government. What followed was not peace, it was fragmentation. Local warlords carved China into personal fiefdoms, and the promise of a unified republic collapsed into decades of internal war. Then, in 1937, a much larger predator arrived. Japan launched a full-scale invasion, and the years that followed were catastrophic, killing an estimated 14 to 20 million Chinese people by the war's end in 1945. And even that horror didn't bring peace. Almost as soon as Japan surrendered, a civil war that had simmered for years between the nationalist government and the Communist Party exploded into full conflict. If you were a farmer in rural China in the late 1940s, you had lived through occupation, famine, and now a war between two Chinese armies claiming to speak for you. In 1949, the Communists won. The nationalist government fled to Taiwan, the island Japan had once seized and China now split in two. And on the mainland, a new state rose from the wreckage, the People's Republic of China. Its leader, Mao Zedong, promised something the country hadn't had in over a century: unity, sovereignty, an end to humiliation. What Mao delivered next was unity at a staggering cost. Starting in 1958, he launched the Great Leap Forward, an attempt to transform China's economy overnight through mass collectivization and backyard steel production. The plan was catastrophic in practice. Grain quotas were wildly overstated, real food was seized to meet impossible targets, and a famine followed that killed an estimated 30 million people or more, one of the deadliest famines in human history. Then, in 1966, Mao launched a second convulsion, the Cultural Revolution, a decade-long campaign to purge old ideas that instead tore apart universities, temples, families, and millions of lives as Red Guards turned on teachers, neighbors, and even their own parents. By the time Mao died in 1976, China was unified in name, but the very ideology that had unified it had also devastated it twice in 20 years. History is on nobody's side automatically. It has to be built and rebuilt, and that's exactly what happened next. In 1978, a very different kind of leader took the reins. Deng Xiaoping had survived the purges of the Cultural Revolution himself, and he made a bet that seemed almost heretical inside a communist state: loosen the economy, let markets in, carefully, selectively, without giving up Communist Party control. He called it socialism with Chinese characteristics, a phrase vague enough to cover an enormous transformation. Deng opened special economic zones, small pockets of the country, starting with a fishing town called Shenzhen, where market rules applied and foreign investment was welcomed. Imagine you're a factory worker in Shenzhen in the early 1980s, watching a quiet fishing village turn into a construction site practically overnight. That transformation became the blueprint for the entire country. Over the following decades, hundreds of millions of people were lifted out of poverty, the fastest large-scale poverty reduction in recorded history. The government that had once tried to erase private enterprise was now the engine driving one of the largest capitalist expansions the world had ever seen, all while keeping single-party political control fully intact. But that promise of prosperity without political change had a breaking point. In the spring of 1989, student-led protests calling for political reform and greater freedoms filled Tiananmen Square in the heart of Beijing, growing into the largest pro-democracy demonstrations in the country's history. On June 4th, 1989, the government sent in troops and tanks, crushing the protests by force, with the death toll, still disputed today, estimated anywhere from the hundreds into the thousands. The message to the country and to the world was unmistakable. Economic liberalization would continue. Political control would not loosen to match it. China's path forward would be prosperity without democracy. China joined the World Trade Organization, and the floodgates opened wider. Global manufacturing poured in. Cities that had been farmland one generation earlier became megacities of 10, 15, 20 million people. High-speed rail networks, built at a pace no democracy could easily replicate, connected them. China became, in the popular phrase, the factory of the world, producing everything from smartphones to solar panels to the clothes on your back. By the 2000s, it had the world's second largest economy, a space program, and a growing global footprint through infrastructure investment across dozens of countries. The Middle Kingdom, humiliated for a century, was once again one of the most powerful economies on Earth. But here's the question worth asking. Was this the end of the story, or just the next chapter? Because underneath the skyline, real cracks are forming. Decades of the one-child policy ended in 2015, left China facing a demographic cliff, a shrinking, rapidly aging workforce with too few young people to support it. A property sector that fueled years of growth is now buckling under staggering debt, shaking confidence in the very model that built modern China's cities. Economic growth, once seemingly unstoppable, has slowed from its explosive peak. And politically, under a leader named Xi Jinping, who has consolidated more personal power than any Chinese leader since Mao, control has tightened rather than loosened. In 1997, Britain handed Hong Kong back to Chinese control under a promise of 50 years of semi-autonomy and separate freedoms. In 2020, following massive pro-democracy protests in the territory, Beijing imposed a sweeping national security law that critics say effectively ended that autonomy decades early. And tension continues to rise over Taiwan, the island that split away in 1949 and that Beijing has never stopped claiming as its own. If you were a young graduate in a Chinese city today, facing a tougher job market than your parents ever did, growth might not feel automatic anymore. It might feel like something that has to be defended. So where does that leave the story? China's trajectory over the last 200 years isn't a straight line up or down. It's a fall from the top, a shattering, and a long, contradictory climb back toward where it started. Whether the 21st century becomes another chapter of return or a new kind of crisis is still being written. In trade negotiations, in chip factories, in demographic charts, and in the waters around Taiwan. What's certain is this: the forces reshaping global trade, technology, and power right now are inseparable from this story. And the next time you pick up a phone, drive past a shipping port, or hear about tensions in the Pacific, you're looking at the latest chapter of a return that started with a humiliation nobody in Beijing has forgotten.